What sounds like fiction but is actually a real historical event. The escape from Antarctica by the members of the Antarctic expedition led by Ernest Shackleton. The stuff they went through was unbelievable. Their boat, the Endurance, was crushed by ice floes. They were stranded on the floes for over a year in temperatures well below freezing. They then took to 3 boats around 22 feet in length across the Antarctic Ocean looking for land. There were about 10 men in each boat. They missed reaching land by just a few miles at times. 2/3 of them got stranded on Elephant Island surrounded by ice while one of the boats went out in search of rescue. That boat made it through the Drake Passage, one of the deadliest places in the ocean. All but 3 of them got stranded with little food and water while the 3 men who left became the first people to cross South Georgia on foot. They found civilization. Rescued the men who came through the Drake Passage. Waited months until they could rescue those on Elephant Island. Every single person who came on the initial voyage survived, with the worst lasting consequence being a single foot amputation. Apparently, death from laughter is an incredibly rare but a completely legit cause of death. In the 3rd century BCE, Chrysippus, a Greek Stoic philosopher, died of laughter after he saw a donkey eating his figs. And Chrysippus is not the only isolated case. Among the few other cases, a 5th century BCE Greek painter, Zeuxis, is said to have died laughing at his painting of the goddess Aphrodite, for which an old woman, who had commissioned the painting, had insisted on modeling. Also, Cleopatra, the ruler of Egypt in the 1st century BCE, claimed that her retainer died laughing at her husband's death. According to the linked Wikipedia article, the most recent case is that of Ole Benson, a Danish audiologist, who saw a funny scene in a comedy film and laughed so hard that his heart rate rose to a point where he had a fatal heart attack, in 1989. From what I understood from reading up on this topic, it's not the act of laughing itself but rather a fatal repercussion from a fit of laughter, such as cardiac arrest, asphyxiation, or aneurysm, which causes death. For instance, Ole Benson suffered a heart attack as a consequence of the terrible fit of laughter he had. It's possible that such was the case of Chrysippus, and others, as well. I always thought of "I'm gonna die laughing" as a hyperbole, and I myself use it quite liberally. But I guess every hyperbole has a grain of truth to it. Some other interesting occurrences. Upon running out of ammo, a pilot of an FM-2 Wildcat, variant of the F-4F, made mock strafing runs on Japanese ships until he got a wild idea to quite literally pull a drive-by on a Japanese battleship. He pulled out his M1911A1 pistol, opened his cockpit, and fired all 7 rounds over the wing of his plane, reloaded, and did it again. There also a TBF Avenger that found a makeshift U.S. Army Air Force runway and landed there to rearm his plane. The pilot asked the Army Air Force guys if they could load his plane up with bombs, fuel, and ammo. The enlisted crew were just about to begin loading up the U.S. Navy Avenger when a captain or major or some shit stepped in and put a halt to it, stating the weapons were for USAF pilots only, not the Navy. The pilot and the tail gunner on the Avenger pulled out their pistols and demanded fuel and bombs. The USAF officer relented and allowed U.S. Navy planes to rearm with USAF weapons. As the Avenger pilot left, he told the USAF officer, if he heard about any more planes being denied fuel and ammo he'd drop what he was doing, come back and shoot him. Some of the pilots even armed their planes with depth charges, meant for use against Japanese subs, from the escort carriers and dropped them in the path of oncoming Japanese ships, hoping they would blow up under the Japanese keels, sinking them. IIRC, several Japanese ships were damaged by depth charges exploding underneath them. The battle off Samar was wild from beginning to end. Russia's fake Dmitry Ivan the Terrible's son assassinated at the age of 8. 9 years later a guy claims to be the Dmitry, having had survived the assassination attempt. He gains the throne and rules for 11 months. Then dragged from the palace and publicly executed. Mark the end of false Dmitry 1, then it gets interesting. The next year a second impostor declared himself Dmitri, but doesn't dispute Dmitri one's legitimacy, instead claiming to be the same guy having miraculously survived his apparent execution a year before, and somehow wins political support of Dmitri one's widow, and with her support gains the allegiance of the Cossacks, rallies an army of over 10,000 strong and tries to take back the throne. Though is mostly failed, he conquers most of southeastern Russia and rule until his untimely death 3 years later, after being beheaded by a Tartar prince in a drunken altercation. Mark end of false Dmitri 2, 3 months later, when Imposted 3 pops up, apparently magically appearing from behind a waterfall in Ivangorod and declared himself Tsar. He follows Dmitri 2's lead and doesn't dispute the other two imposters, instead claiming some sort of spiritual reincarnation or magical resurrection, to establish himself as the same guy. He managed to win support of the same Cossacks who supported Dmitri 2's claim. He was forced to flee his stronghold only a year later, where he was speared on the way to Moscow and secretly executed, though he never actually ruled. Historians stuck with the theme, naming him false Dmitri III. History gets fuzzy here, with some source citing a false Dmitri IV, while others say it is counting Dmitri III twice. Fake Dmitri I was a known fake. The powers that be used him until he was trouble and then executed him, they quartered him, cremating what was left, stuffed the ashes in a can, and shoot him in a cannon back to Poland where he was from. There was a NASA and US government-funded experiment to teach a dolphin English so it could potentially be used in place of a human for the space program in the 60s. A dolphin, named Peter, was raised from birth in a half-submerged facility with a female trainer. He received daily lessons to attempt to teach him to pronounce human syllables. Issues arose, however, when he reached adolescence. Because dolphins may actually have a stronger libido than humans, Peter became very aggressive and non-compliant from sexual frustration. Plans to offer conjugal visits with female dolphins was cancelled, as they didn't want exposure to dolphin behavior to interfere with the experiment. Instead, the handler offered to give the dolphin a handjob every so often, which was allowed. This did reduce his aggressive tendencies, and apparently also improved his lessons. When it started to become apparent that the dolphin was incapable of learning English and instead was just imitating the syllable patterns in return for his handler's affection, the people overseeing the experiment took on an extra project to test LSD on the dolphin. For some reason, they also gave LSD to the handler. I guess at this point, the people funding all of this came in for a visit, to find they were funding LSD-fueled interspecies handjobs. It seems it was promptly decided to instead just use human astronauts. He only had few strains of hair, so thought to shave his balls and stick up his cheeks and neck. This was a long time ago and he had done it with a double-edged razor. As he was gently scratching his way through, his hands were sweating and shaking as he was halfway through one of the edge slightly ripped of the skin of his hand. "'Cause my old man was very nervous, he then cut his sack and one of the ball was on the verge of dropping out. At that time fortunately my grandma was knitting sweaters for my dad, then she heard grandpa from the room above, so she rushed up to check on him. There and behold my grandpa besides the cupboard looking at the mirror and his sack in one hand and the razor on other with drops of blood making a puddle on the floor. Then grandma realized she can sew his balls together. The two trying to get the other small toes together. She processed to sew it with the silk thread attached to a sewing needle. Of course the needle was blunt, so she had to heat it with the lighter which was placed conveniently in my grandpa's jeans on the bed. The red-hot needle was ready and it went through the base of his dick and through the top of the sack leading the way down to the middle and snapped the thread hanging little bit out and his balls off-center by a bit, but the work was done. Back then, there was a man named Phineas Gage. He was a hard-working man. Determined, and was said to be a good leader. One of his job was to put dynamite into a huge boulder to destroy it because they were building railroad tracks, new at the time. He was to drill a hole in the boulder, put in the dynamite, pack it in with sand and clay using something called a tamping iron. Sharp at the top, round at the bottom. Gage puts the dynamite into the boulder and then used the tamping iron to push it down. However, he forgot to put in the most important ingredient, sand. When he shoved the tamping iron in, it created a spark, which sparked the dynamite. The dynamite blew up, which caused the 13-pound rod to shoot up. Unbeknownst to Gage, his head would be in the way. The sharp end of the rod enters his cheek, goes behind his eyeball, shoots through his brain and then going through his head entirely, landing 80 yards away. Gage was out for a few minutes, but he miraculously stood up with little help. After the incident, Gage was said to be a completely different man. He was once a determined thinker, a good leader. Was now an incoherent drunk who would yell out the grossest profanity. 13 years later, he would then have a mass seizure that would lead him to premature death. At age 36, he had no wife and no children to pass on his legacy. A broadcast signal hijacking of 2 television stations in Chicago, Illinois was carried out on November 22, 1987, in an act of video piracy. The station's broadcasts were interrupted by a video of an unknown person wearing a Max Headroom mask and costume, accompanied by distorted audio. The first incident took place for 25 seconds during the sports segment of WGN-TV's 9 p.m. news broadcast. The second occurred around 2 hours later, for about 90 seconds during PBS affiliate WTTW's broadcast of Doctor Who. The hacker made references to Max Headroom's endorsement of Coca-Cola, the TV series Clutch Cargo, WGN anchor Chuck Swirsky, and All the Greatest World Newspaper Nerds, a reference to WGN's call letters, which stand for World's Greatest Newspaper. A corrugated panel swiveled back and forth mimicking Max Headroom's geometric background effect. The video ended with a pair of exposed buttocks being spanked with a fly's water before normal programming resumed. The culprits were never caught or identified. Joe Medicine Crow, the last war chief. Born 1913, he was a Native American who was part of the Crow tribe. In tribes like the Crow tribes there were war chiefs, and to become one you needed to complete 4 requirements. 1. Touch an enemy without killing him. 2. Disarm an enemy. 3. Lead a successful war party. 4. Steal an enemy's horse. Horses were really valuable. And when World War II broke out he set his mind on those goals. He did the first 3 requirements, the third in which he lead a group 7 men armed with explosives into German-occupied land. But it was the fourth that seemed impossible. Not only did he need to find a horse but steal it too. Then on one mission Medicine Crow's leader spotted a German outpost with a barn filled with horses. They were going to bomb it, but Medicine Crow didn't want the horses to die, so he volunteered to go by himself and steal them. So at night he snuck into the barn with only a pistol and some rope and opened the gate. He mounted the most confident-looking horse and used the rope he had to steer it. So he galloped off with all the other horses following him. He began to sing a Native American war song. Then the Americans started bombing the outpost. So there he was, Joe Medicine Crow, riding away from a German war camp being bombed while leading 50 stolen horses chanting a war cry. The Battle of the Crater in the American Civil War. Near the end of the war, during Grant's sieges near Petersburg and Richmond, one of his lower commanders had a great idea. Why not dig a hole under enemy lines, plant a shit ton of explosives under it, then blow it up and waltz through the new gap in the fortifications to flank them. Nice plan, right? It went pretty well, too, for a while. They did successfully dig under Confederate lines, planted all their explosives, and blew it up. The rebels were taken completely by surprise as a giant chunk was blown out of their trenches, leaving the eponymous gaping crater where the explosion occurred. Then, much like the explosives they used, they totally blew it. The Union commander ordered his men forward into the breach. But they ran down into the crater to get to it. The rebels that had managed to recover and get their bearings realized that they had the high ground in a brand new shooting gallery. The Confederate commander even called it a turkey shoot. After a few hours, the Union was forced to retreat back to their own trenches, having lost many men in the crater. Both sides lost thousands of men, and absolutely nothing was gained. It's one of my favorite instances of dumb-ass shit that ever happened in a war. Has the Great Emu War of 1932 been mentioned? The conflict between the Australian populace and swarms of drought-starved emus. After 2 unsuccessful military deployments, the Australian government relinquished and declared the emus victorious. Some notable losses for the Australian military were a severe expenditure of ammunition, over 5,000 shots fired per day with only 100 dead emus to show, and at one point a civilian pickup truck fitted with a mounted machine. After the gun proved unable to accurately aim on the rough terrain they had to traverse in pursuit of emu pelotons, the driver attempted a hit-and-run tactic on one of the slower stragglers, which very quickly turned into a kamikaze maneuver as the emu slid over the bonnet, into and through the windshield, got stuck in the steering wheel and caused the vehicle to veer off course and crash. Australian ornithologist Dominic Cerventi was quoted saying, "The machine gunner's dreams of point-blank fire into serried masses of emus were soon dissipated. The Emu Command had evidently ordered guerrilla tactics, and its unwieldy army soon split up into innumerable small units that made use of the military equipment uneconomic. A crestfallen field force therefore withdrew from the combat area after about a month." Gregor MacGregor. He was some random Scottish adventurer during the 19th century that somehow became a general in the Venezuelan War of Independence from Spain and took it upon himself to invade Florida and briefly created the Republic of Florida. Upon his successful capture of an island in Florida, he was like see ya to his men and abandoned them to be captured. After a bunch of military failures in South America, he went back to London and sold a whole bunch land deeds to a country that didn't exist in Central America called Kazakh with a whole bunch of fake documents and media attention he created. Eventually, multiple boats of settlers actually sailed to Central America. Unfortunately, when they got there, the captain of the boats couldn't find where the non-existent capital city of St. Joseph was. They eventually gave up and went ashore in a place called Mosquito Coast, where 2/3 of them died from tropical diseases. Then MacGregor tried the same scheme in Paris and more schemes again in England. He never really ended up paying for his crimes because, in the end, he went back to South America where he got a pension for his military duty in the Venezuela army and was able to live out the rest of his life comfortably. Here's one of my favorites. During the First Crusade, the Crusaders came and sieged a city. The city had some hold in there, as well as she Sultan's wife, and some of the kids. The Byzantine emperor, for whom the crusade was technically being fought, wasn't the biggest fan of the Crusaders because they didn't give him back the lands they were there to capture for him. So the emperor had some of his men sneak into the city and make the deal with the garrison. They can leave with the Sultan's wife, her kids, and as much gold as they can carry, but they give the city to the emperor and not the Crusaders. They agree. The next morning after the plan was implemented, the Crusaders wake up, see the Byzantine flag fly on the walls of the city they are sieging. They come up to congratulate the Byzantines and ask to come in to rest, resupply, etc. They are told sure you can come in. 3 at a time. Which is a pretty sizable middle finger given it's an army of thousands. In a separate incident during the First Crusade, the emperor sent some carpenters on a ship to help make siege engines for a siege. When they arrived they found that oops, no trees available. But luckily they had their ships. So the mad lads repurposed ships into siege equipment. Amo Koivunen, Finnish soldier in World War II. From Wikipedia, 3 days into their mission, on March 18, the group was attacked and surrounded by Soviet forces, from which they managed to escape. Koivunen became fatigued after skiing for a long distance, but could not stop. He was also the sole carrier of army-issue Provitin, or metha, a stimulant used to remain awake while on duty. Koivunen had trouble pulling out a single pill, so he emptied the entire bottle of 30 capsules into his hand and took them all. He had a short burst of energy, but then entered into a state of delirium, and lost consciousness. Koivunen remembered waking up the following morning, separated from his patrol and having no supplies. In the following days, he escaped Soviet forces once again, was injured by a landmine, and laid in a ditch for a week waiting for help. After skiing more than 400 kilometers, 250 miles, he was found and admitted to a nearby hospital, where his heart rate was measured at 200 beats per minute, double the average human heartbeat, and weighing only 43 kilograms, 94 pounds. In the week Koivunen was gone, he subsisted only on pine buds and a single Siberian jay that he caught and ate raw. Just look at him, this is the man who saw everything. https://en.m.wikipedia.org/wiki/amo_koivunen $3AA_file%3AAMO_koivunen.png. The Attack of the Dead Men. In 1915 during WW1, the Russians were defending a fort in Poland from the Germans. The Germans tried on 2 different occasions to assail the fort with no luck, despite having superior technology and the Russian weaponry being outdated. Then the Germans brought in a new commander. He opted for a gas attack. The gas in question was a chlorine/bromine mix. Being that this was WW1, delivery methods of gas weapons were, well, primitive. The Germans brought up bats of the gas to be used and waited for the wind to blow towards the Russians. When it did, they opened the vats and the gas inside wafted with the wind to the Russian fort. The gas killed everything in its path and turned every green thing black. It reached the Russians and destroyed their lungs. The Germans then attacked expecting everyone in the fort to be dead. Only, much to their shock and horror, they got a nasty surprise when they found that not only were the Russians still alive, they were ready for a fight. The Russians, coughing up pieces of their own lungs, charged the Germans and drove them back again.